How could we forget to make sure we have hot chocolate? Without hot chocolate, Christmas Eve just won't feel like Christmas Eve. Connie Hansen was so upset that her voice began to shake. Paul agreed with this when she first said it an hour ago. The second time, just 15 minutes ago, he impatiently told her that they would have to do without him. This time, with just over an hour left before midnight mass, he lost patience. If you're so upset about the lack of hot chocolate, Connie, why don't you go out and get some yourself? There's probably an open Starbucks somewhere. Okay, I'll do that, but I give you my word that I won't bring you a single drop. With these words, she stood up and headed towards the kitchen door. Why are we fighting over this? Damn chocolate isn't worth it. However, he wasn't going to give in unless she did the same. As she pulled out of the driveway, he was horrified to see that it was snowing, heavily snowing. He tried to call and tell her to be careful, but the call went straight to voicemail. She must have turned off her cell phone. Would we have such a stupid argument on Christmas Eve if we had kids? But 3 miscarriages in less than 3 years, the last of which sent her to the hospital for 2 days, caused Connie's gynecologist to strongly recommend a hysterectomy. After much thought and many tears, they agreed and gave up the dream of having a family. The last 2 years have been difficult. Sometimes Connie was sullen, even harsh. Several times he found her crying for no apparent reason, but she said it was nothing and refused to talk about it. He sat and looked out the living room window, watching the snow fall through the reflected lights on the Christmas tree and worrying that they were moving away from each other. Father Michael Murphy, rector of Our Lady of Sorrows Catholic community, walked through the sanctuary, making sure everything was ready for the midnight mass. As usual, several people were already sitting in the pews, although it was only a little after 20 Hauk, and the mass began at 21 Taugsche. Why do we still call it midnight mass? We haven't started this late in 45, 50 years. People just don't want to stay up that late. The family mass at 4:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve was the most attended Christmas mass. The church was packed with people who came for the procession with children dressed as characters from Luke's favorite story, traditional carols, and a reenactment of a birth in a stable that took the place of a sermon. He chuckled quietly at the thought. I wonder who is happier not having to preach, them or me. Walking down the aisle to make sure extra envelopes for Christmas offerings were available next to the ballot, he shook his head at the irony of how important Christmas collections are to the parish's budget. But our received wisdom still insists that the vulgar commercialization of Christmas is due to the fact that holiday shopping is so important to merchants' profits. He returned to the sacristy to put on his vestments, hoping that the snowfall that had begun would soon cease. They had enough snow for a white Christmas, and he wanted those who attended Mass to be able to travel home safely. Connie sat in her car, idling at the Starbucks drive-through window, gripping and releasing the steering wheel in frustration. Hurry up! I need to go home and apologize, and get ready for midnight Mass. Just as she was about to leave without her 2 hot chocolates, the barista, who looked more Connie's age than a high school or college graduate, opened her small window and held out 2 paper cups. Sorry for the delay. It's hard to find someone to work on Christmas Eve, and I'm here alone. I won't charge you for them. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas. Connie took the cups without comment, and the barista began to close the window. Come on, Connie, it's not her fault. Quickly placing the cups in the cup holders, Connie turned to the window. Wait! The barista paused and then slowly opened the window again. I didn't thank you. I'm sorry. I was rude. I know it's not your fault. Thank you very much. And I wish you a very Merry Christmas, too. As she pulled away toward the street, she didn't notice a pickup truck skidding in the oncoming lane. She carefully pulled out onto the snowy surface of the street, only to watch in helpless horror as a slowly rotating pickup truck slammed into her right front fender, knocking her car to the side of the road. Connie lowered her head to the steering wheel and visualized her mantra. I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry. The driver of the pickup truck got out and approached Connie. She rolled down the window. Are you okay? She nodded, too upset to speak. I'm so sorry. Once it started spinning, I couldn't control it. It's so slippery here. I'll call 911. Were you hurt? I have insurance. Damn. Oh, sorry, I really ruined your Christmas. I'm so sorry. I hope you can forgive me. Are you really okay? He said all this without stopping to breathe. I'm fine, but I really need to go home. Can we just exchange data without waiting for the police? Just then, a police car slowly pulled up with its lights flashing. The policeman approached cautiously and commented on how slippery the streets were. I saw what happened. No one was driving too fast for the conditions. The damage was minor. Was anyone hurt? They both assured him that they were fine. It's Christmas Eve. Why don't you just exchange insurance information and go home? He wished them a Merry Christmas and began to leave, then returned to Connie. Your car looks drivable, but the tire took quite a hit. Be very careful when driving home. She thanked him and left before he reached the cruiser. The guy in the pickup truck had already left. After driving less than 3 blocks, a loud noise was heard from the right front side and the steering wheel began to shake. Oh no! She turned to the side of the road and got out. The right front tire burst. She opened the trunk, but it was empty. She didn't know where the spare was, or even if they had one. She tried her mantra again. I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry. This time, it didn't work. Tears began to flow as she pulled out her phone to call AAA. When she discovered that the phone was off, she remembered that she had turned it off right after she left because she was so angry with Paul. Stupid. It was getting colder outside, so she got back in the car and called AAA. Connie realized that she had not yet called Paul to tell him what had happened. She called, not knowing if he had already left for Mass, but there was no answer. Then a voicemail. Please forgive me, Paul. I'll be home as soon as I can get there. She started to cry, but pulled herself together enough to finish. It's all my fault. I love you so much. Please forgive me. God forgive me. While about to end the call, she accidentally turned off the phone. When the AAA tow truck arrived, she thanked the driver for his quick arrival. He shrugged. It's Christmas Eve. Not many people are on the streets. What's the problem? She came out and showed him the flat tire. He walked around to the trunk and lifted the floor, revealing a small tire and tools. He replaced the blown tire with a spare one, put the blown tire back in the trunk, and asked her to sign the paperwork. Fearing the tiny tire and slippery streets, she spent 30 minutes driving home. Paul waited until 8:30 p.m., tried calling Connie one last time, then quickly wrote a note and taped it to the kitchen door. Grabbing his jacket from the hallway, he reluctantly walked out to his Prius and headed to the church, not noticing that he had left his phone on the kitchen table. Snow began to stick to the streets, and what would normally be a half-hour drive took closer to 45 minutes. He arrived late for midnight mass, just as Father Mike began reading the gospel. He kept looking at the place where Connie should have been sitting next to him, but for the first time in almost 10 years, she wasn't there. He could not immerse himself in the spirit of the Mass. Mechanical prayers and answers faded into the background. Why did I have to lose my temper tonight? What a stupid argument over hot chocolate on Christmas Eve. The sound of people getting up and starting to move along the communion lane woke Paul and increased his anxiety. Why didn't Connie come home? Is she still angry? Where could she be? She drove well. He didn't care too much about snowy streets, but she could be stubborn. The same as me. He received the sacrament, passed the chalice, and with little remorse left before the end of the Mass. Sometimes he complained to Connie when others did, but this was different. I need to go back to Connie and apologize. When Connie pulled into their driveway, she was saddened to see the footprints Paul had left when he left for Mass, already half covered in fresh snow. She found his note taped to the kitchen door. Sorry I'm such a stubborn idiot. Please do not go to Mass if it is still snowing. God will understand. I love you. She was torn. Mass had probably already started, but she wanted to apologize. She was very stubborn and an idiot. Despite his request to stay home and her anxiety about the weather, she went to church very carefully. The snowfall was getting heavier. He was worried and in a hurry to get home, and County Road 21 was almost 5 miles shorter than his usual route. He rarely drove this way because the road was poorly maintained, but everyone was moving so slowly tonight that it might have been faster. Plus, he wasn't going fast enough for the potholes to matter. He pulled out of the church parking lot and turned left instead of right. Still upset about their fight, he drove too fast. The black ice at the turn took him by surprise. The anti-lock brakes kicked in when he stepped on the pedal, but the Prius continued to slide down the road until it came to a stop in a dry patch near the edgy. He flipped over, somersaulting twice as he descended 50 feet down a steep snow slope. Continuing to slide rapidly on his tires, he crashed into a large pine tree near the driver's door. When the car overturned, the windows broke and the airbags deployed. The collision with the tree slammed Paul's head into the doorframe and knocked him unconscious. When he came to, he wasn't sure how much time had passed, but he was already freezing. His left arm and leg were pinned under the damaged metal, and his left eye had difficulty seeing. Everything hurts. The pain was most painful over my left eye. He touched his forehead with his right hand, but pulled it away with an explosion of pain when he touched it. His fingers were wet with blood, and he could feel the blood running down the left side of his head. He lost consciousness again. Father Mike was closing the side doors when she entered the church. It took her almost an hour to get here. She was still shaken from the encounter, and the snow was getting heavier. "Connie? What? Why, Paul?" "It's a long story, Father, and a shameful one. We quarreled over something stupid. How long has it been since the end of the Mass?" "Paul left right after communion, which he almost never does, but I assumed it was because of the snow. That was about 15 or 20 minutes ago. Would you like me to give you communion?" No, I need to find him." "No, thank you, Father. I'll come to morning Mass. Maybe. It all depends. Now I want to find Paul and apologize to him." Father Mike blessed Connie and made the sign of the cross on her forehead. "Be careful, Connie. The roads must be very slippery right now." "Thank you, Father. I will." Bless Paul, too. She returned to her car and turned right out of the parking lot. She drove part of the way home, then took her foot off the gas. If he is as regretful and upset as I am, he rushes home. I'll bet he took the quickest route. She slowly rolled to the edge of the road, turned around, and headed home the other way, towards CR 21. Father Mike closed the front and side doors, then returned to the sanctuary. He lifted the book of the Gospels from the pulpit to return it to the sacristy, but it slipped out of his hands. As the book fell to the floor, it opened to the page of Epiphany. The Gospel reading was verses 1 through 12 from the 2nd chapter of Matthew. Picking up the book and closing it, he read the last 2 lines, and, having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another route. He placed the book in the sacristy, took off his vestments, and put on his jacket, then went out and locked the door behind him. On the way to the rector, something bothered him. He stopped to think, and, having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another route. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold and snow. Rushing the last steps towards the rector's office, he quickly opened the door, walked to the phone on his desk, and called the sheriff's department. "Mineral County Sheriff's Department. How can we help?" "Are you a dispatcher?" "Yes." "Who's calling, please?" "Oh, sorry, this is Father Mike Murphy from Our Lady of Sorrows." "Hello, Father Mike! It's Donna Shepherd. I attended a family mass this afternoon. How did you ring on Christmas Eve?" "This may seem strange, but could you send someone on duty to the front door of the church and ask him to hurry? I'm afraid one of the parishioners may need help." "Of course, Father. Can I ask?" "I'll explain later, Donna. I'm pretty sure it's very important. Can I stay on the line while you call him?" "Of course, Father." She contacted both vehicles and asked them to provide their location. Deputy Sam Good's response put him several miles closer to the church, so she asked him to meet Father Mike on the front steps of Our Lady of Sorrows and hurry, but without the sirens or flashing lights. He replied that he had turned around and would be there in 20 minutes. After Father Mike heard both sides of the broadcast, he thanked Donna and hung up. God, let me be wrong. He returned to the church to wait. Paul's mind seemed out of whack. He found it difficult to control his thoughts. Where's Connie? Why is it so cold? Why does my head hurt so much? He began to remember the evening, the quiet dinner, the quarrel with Connie over the lack of hot chocolate. Connie? Why didn't she come home? Did something happen to her? Or maybe she's still angry? No, it can't be. Not because of such a stupid fight over hot chocolate. The thoughts just poured out, moving so fast that they seemed to collide with each other. There must have been something else bothering her. Something that had hit her hard. Something really powerful. What else could be bothering her, especially on Christmas Eve? What? Oh my God, it's probably kids. She can't have any more children. I was so busy that I felt sorry for myself for not paying enough attention to how this was affecting her. Not only thoughts, but also images. Connie in the hospital room after surgery. She said, "You'll never have a son or a daughter, Paul. I'm so sorry." And I said, "It's okay, Connie, as long as you get better." I figured it would make her feel better. But it was a lie. I didn't feel comfortable with it. I was very unhappy. She knew I was lying. It made her feel worse, not better. From then on, we had something in common. We both felt sorry for me. Oh God, Connie. I'm so sorry I didn't think about you in my self-pity. Another image, almost a year after a wonderful candlelit dinner. Very good Cabernet Franc. Coffee and cognac in the living room after dinner. Paul, you've been so quiet the last few days. What's bothering you? Yes, I was silent. I was alarmed. I was thinking about adoption. Connie would be a wonderful mother, and I would be happy to be a father. Of course, it would be better if they were our own blood, but they would be with us. And over time, they wouldn't be the next best. They would be the best. At least that's what they said in fairy tales. But I was afraid to raise this issue with Connie. Wouldn't this mean that every day she would have to face her inability to have children? Mourning the loss of your femininity? How can I ask her for this? My own desire to become a father overrode my concerns for Connie. Now it's obvious that I wasn't worried about Connie's feelings, but that she would say no. That's why I had this wonderful candlelit dinner with wine, then coffee and cognac in the living room. I tried to make it her idea, not mine. Connie, have you thought about adoption? Her look immediately told me that my fears were justified. She wanted nothing to do with it. Adopt? No, I didn't really think... She looked scared, as if she had heard a strange noise at night. And you? She looked at me, begging me to say anything other than yes. I was immediately filled with shame. I knew it would hurt her greatly. I knew it would hurt her when I planned this dinner to get her ready. When I chose wine and cognac to seduce her into making my desires more important than her grief. So I said what she wanted to hear, and we spent the last 2 years slowly drifting away from each other every day. What have we done, God, that you punish us like this? Oh God, Connie, I love you so much. I am so sorry. The flicker of consciousness faded, and Paul's body continued to shut down non-vital functions. His only task now is survival. Connie drove slowly along County Road 21, barely noticing the potholes, which, thanks to the snow, were almost invisible and much less noticeable. As she approached the turn where Paul ran off the road, she thought she saw headlights below, on the other side of the road. She took her foot off the gas and touched the brakes, but the road was very slippery. Stopping without going to the side of the road, she turned on her hazard lights and got out. Leaving the engine running and the door open, she hurried across the road as quickly as possible and saw Paul's car smashed against a tree. Oh, dear God, please let him be okay. Please let him be okay. She took her phone out of her jacket pocket and began dialing 911 when a wave of dizziness caused her to lose her balance. She waved her arms, throwing the phone out of her hand. Her legs slid out from under her and she went face down towards the bottom. The snow found its way under her jacket and blouse, and her face skidded across the frozen ground under a layer of snow. She continued to slide quickly until her left ankle became stuck in the snow under the rear passenger wheel of Paul's car. A stuck ankle stopped her, but her leg twisted and she heard a crunch. The pain from her leg to her hip was so intense that her brain was blocking all sensory input. For several moments, she lay unconscious in the snow. Mineral County Sheriff's Deputy Sam Good made a left turn in an SUV cruiser. What could a priest have that is so important if it is not an emergency? Okay. Maybe this will be more interesting than the current situation. There was not much excitement this Christmas evening. He drove around the block and headed towards the church. The priest waited at the main entrance, although the temperature dropped to 10 degrees and continued to fall. He described his concerns and asked Sam to hurry up. The story sounded unlikely, but Sam was looking forward to driving the CR-21 back into town. At least it will be more interesting. He told the dispatcher that he was leaving Our Lady of Sorrows. I'll drive back into town on CR-21, then stop by the guy's house. Do you have his address? Donna returned to him a few minutes later with Paul and Connie's address. Connie came to her senses and tried to stand on her right leg, but fell in pain. Even though the windows were broken, she hadn't heard a sound from Paul since she crashed into the car. She was afraid for him and was in pain, but she didn't need her mantra. I need to be strong for Paul, not cry. Her light jacket was little protection against the cold. In fact, it only made things worse as the snow inside began to melt. Grinding her teeth in pain, she managed to get up on her right knee and open the door, but she could only open it a few inches. She herself was in the way. Do not panic. There must be a way out. She lay face down in the snow, planning to open the door above her, but the door opened on its own. It was good, but she didn't have the strength to get up again. She just lay there, exhausted, in pain, and shaking uncontrollably. After a few minutes of rest, she was able to rise to her right knee and turn toward the car. Trying to ignore the worst pain she had ever experienced, she placed her palms on the threshold of the door and pulled herself inside. She was exhausted, but her love for Paul gave her the strength to get back on her right knee. The pain was even stronger, but she was next to him. She could touch it, but she couldn't reach the door to close it. Despite the overwhelming pain, she refused to give up. Enough light from the headlights was scattered by the snow that she could see Paul's bloody head and face, the gruesome gash above his left eye. His left arm and leg were clamped with some kind of metal. He was unconscious but breathing. Talk to him. Tell him how much you love him. Keep him alive. She lowered her hand and took his cold hand. I found you, Paul. I knew you'd take the shortest route. It's all my fault. I kept arguing over that damn hot chocolate. She stopped when the pain took her breath away, but she had to keep talking. I can't believe how stubborn and stupid I was. Of course, it wasn't just because of the hot chocolate. If only I could stop shaking. It's time to tell him. This may be my last chance. Sam saw a car on the road. Turning on his hazard lights, he stopped and parked behind the Camry. Noticing the headlights on the other side, I gave the license number to the dispatcher. The driver was unconscious. Blood soaked his coat. His face was bleeding, and the wound on his forehead looked bad. I need to get you out of here first, madam, to get you warm. He picked her up and tried to pull her back, but she screamed in pain. Stop, my leg. Who are you? Why did you hurt me? Oh, shit. Deputy Sam Good, madam. I'm sorry I hurt you, but I need to get you out of this car and somewhere warm. Your left leg, right? Yeah, I think it's broken. Happened when I crashed into the car. He must help Paul first. But my husband is much more seriously injured. You must help him first. She tried to raise her voice, but it came out hoarse. Madam, I need to get you out of here first before I can help him. The car is leaning against a tree and I won't be able to get to him while you're here. Can you help me? He thought he might be able to reach the man from the back seat, but she needed to warm up first to prevent her hypothermia from worsening. Connie thought for a moment, then nodded. She spoke more slowly now. Maybe with your help I could roll over onto my back. That would make it easier for you to get me out of the car. But please don't forget, I can't do anything with my left leg. Now help me turn over on... Right, my left leg hurts so much. She took a deep breath. Put your hands on my hips. Feeling awkward, he placed his hands on her hips. I hope this is the right decision. When she said, okay, he turned her body to the right as she pushed herself off the back of the seat. She cried out in pain twice, but ended up on her back. She took several deep breaths. Now what? He recalled that victims feel better if they believe they are being helped by someone who cares about them. Why don't you tell me your name? You look too young for me to keep calling you madam. She almost smiled. Connie Hansen. I'm Sam Good, Connie, and we'll take care of you both. Thanks, Sam. She sounded a little less tense. Wait a minute. I'll be right back. He walked over to the cruiser, opened the door, then walked back to the Prius. I'm going to carry you into the cruiser and put you in the driver's seat. I'm afraid it will hurt, but we need to get you warm. He lifted her with one hand under her and the other under her small back and lifted her up. She bit the collar of her jacket, trying not to scream. It didn't go smoothly and clearly caused a lot of pain, but he managed to get her into her seat behind the wheel. His hands and coat were wet, but she had almost stopped shaking. He knew she needed to get rid of the wet clothes, even though he turned the heat on high. He closed the door, walked around, and sat down in the passenger seat. Connie, you need to take off those wet clothes. You're very close to hypothermia. She was already in a state of mild hypothermia that was worsening to moderate, but she didn't need to know that. Are you sure? The stove heats up pretty well. Her voice was dull. Yes, you will continue to lose heat in these wet things. Please, Connie, take them off. She was able to unbutton her jacket, but due to the pain and cold hands, she couldn't take it off. I'm afraid you'll have to help me. He took off her jacket as carefully as possible, but he could see that it still hurt her. She tried to unbutton her blouse, but her fingers wouldn't obey. I'm afraid you'll have to do it for me. She leaned back in despair. There was no way to remove her wet jeans without severe pain. He took the trauma scissors out of the first aid kit, that wouldn't be pleasant for either of us, and cut the rest of the clothes. Pulling them out from under her caused some pain, but it was inevitable. She needed to get dry. He wrapped her in the blanket from the emergency kit and made sure the heater ducts were pointed at her. When I leave, don't wrap the blanket around you. Keep it open to direct the warm air towards you. Trust me, Connie, it will warm you up faster. She nodded slowly again. Fine. She opened the blankets without waiting for him to leave. He's already seen everything. The warmth from the stove was so pleasant. Now please save Paul. He grabbed the first aid kit and the last 2 blankets and walked over to the Prius. Before entering, he contacted the dispatcher. The situation is bad. Both victims are injured, one seriously, both suffering from hypothermia. The ambulance will not be able to lift the victims up to the ambulance. The slope is too steep and slippery. They will have to use a stretcher and lift them back to the road. Twice. Donna assured him that a rescue truck was on the way with an ambulance, ETA, in less than 10 minutes. He entered the Prius and closed the door. Can you hear me, sir? There was no answer. It was obvious that he would not be able to pull the man out until the car was moved away from the tree. He placed the flashlight on the dashboard and examined the wound on his forehead. It was still bleeding, and the whole area felt a little soft. Although the man was unconscious, he groaned as Sam examined the wound. He applied the bandage as carefully as possible, continuing to speak soothing words. After administering first aid, he wrapped him in blankets. At least his clothes were mostly dry. He considered trying to start the car and turn on the heater, but he smelled gasoline. He wasn't familiar enough with the Prius to risk a fire, so he turned off the ignition, but left the headlights on. They started to fade, but lasted quite a long time. As a last thought, he took off his heavy jacket and added it to his cocoon of blankets. Just as he was about to go back to check on the woman, he saw the flashing lights of the ambulance and rescue truck reflected in the snowy trees. God bless! I hope they're not late. He went out to meet the doctors. Almost immediately after the ambulance stopped, the paramedic walked down to the wrecked car with her bag on slippery feet. Sam didn't recognize her. She must be new. Quite cute. He handed over control to her and gave her a quick briefing. Woman keeping warm in cruiser. Left tibia appears to be broken. Shock. Mild to moderate hypothermia. Man pinned behind wheel. Unconscious. Serious head injury. Homeless alasia. Also hypothermia. She quickly entered the Prius and opened her bag. After inspecting the head wound, good job on the bandage. She checked Paul's vital signs, then picked up her radio. She repeated Sam's briefing, and then her voice became urgent. I need help here right now. We have a head injury with significant blood loss. BP is 80/55. Temperature is 97.1. Pulse is 125 and erratic. We need to get him upstairs ASAP so we can start infusing Ringer's solution and warm him up. Sam started to say something about raising a stretcher for rescue, but she beat him to it. Tell the rescue team to prepare the stretcher and lower it down. A woman with hypothermia and a fractured tibia and fibula is warming up in the sheriff's vehicle. She will be the last one. Sam didn't want to interrupt, but decided he had to complete the picture. I had to cut her clothes off. They were wet from the melting snow. The paramedic looked at him, then smiled. Hard work. Didn't peek at her, did you? When he frowned, she retreated. Of course not. We are all professionals. Before Sam could respond, a second medic arrived. The first remained in the role of leader. Okay. First, we'll get this guy out of the car. 3 of us should be enough to pull the front end off the tree. With some groaning and straining, they managed to move it enough to open the door. The door was stuck, but Sam took a crowbar from the sheriff's car and managed to open the door and then free the panel that was pinning Paul's arm and leg. The stretcher made 2 trips up and down the slope. Both victims were wrapped in blankets and restrained. Each was taken to an ambulance where they were stabilized. The tow truck arrived just as the second ambulance left for the emergency room. After preparing to tow, the driver pulled the sheriff's car backwards, transporting Sam and the paramedics. Sam waited to make sure the Prius was securely secured to the tow truck, then went to the emergency room to thank the paramedics and check on the victims. In the emergency room, Sam saw the paramedic at the nurse's desk as soon as he entered the emergency room. She saw him, smiled shyly, and walked over. I'm really sorry about the voyeurism joke. We see so much bad that we use a really lousy sense of humor as a defense. She found it difficult to maintain eye contact with him. Yes, I understand. So do we. I just didn't expect it. Why, because I'm not one of your fraternity? Or because I'm a girl? She maintained eye contact for a moment, almost defiantly, then turned and walked out of the emergency room. Crap, would love to see this without the baggy shape. He shook his head and walked over to the nurse's desk to ask about the accident victims. The shift manager came over a couple of minutes later. They knew each other from too many similar encounters. How are they feeling? She flipped through a few sheets of paper on the clipboard and answered without looking up. Still alive? She smiled sadly. Sam learned another self-defense humor. Mr. Hansen has a severe cranial fracture. He has lost a lot of blood, received 2 units, may receive at least 1 more. His left humerus is broken. His left shoulder is dislocated. He is slightly hypothermic. The orthopedic and neurosurgeon are on the way. They should be ready for surgery by the time he gets ready. She turned her attention back to the clipboard. An X-ray. We used a portable one. Does not show whether there is a cerebral hemorrhage. That requires an MRI. She checked a few more pages. The radiologist raised the alarm because a loose fragment of the skull was separated from the impact. First, they will work on his head, then his arm and shoulder. The official condition has not been declared. I would call it critical. It all depends on what the neurosurgeon finds. She looked up. This is certainly not for public discussion. Sam nodded. Certainly. He knew it, and she knew he knew it. But she was a professional, just like the paramedic. Sam was about to ask about Connie, but she beat him to it, speaking without taking her eyes off the clipboard. Mrs. Hansen is still being X-rayed. Her leg is clearly broken and her face is badly damaged from the fall. She looked at him without raising her head and was relieved to see no disapproval in his description of the injury. She's only slightly hypothermic thanks to your heating therapy in the police car. She glanced sideways at him. It probably helped your temperature, too. We're all professionals, so I'm told. Don't mind my temperature. He smiled briefly to show that everything was okay, and she smiled back. He returned to serious conversation. She was in a lot of pain. Did you give her anything for it? Yeah, but that's one tough woman. That leg should have killed her. Sam nodded. Yeah, She's a lot tougher than me. I'm sure her leg will need surgery, too. The podiatrist kids will have to deal with a rather irritated Santa in the morning." She carefully put the clipboard away. He laughed, thanked her, and headed for the door. He didn't look forward to paperwork at the end of his shift. "Well, it gives me something to do. Not that I have anything else to do for Christmas." It took 2 months for their bodies and spirits to recover. They repeated what they thought or said in those painful, frozen hours, assuring each other of their love. Now they will look to the future with one mind and spirit. They decided not to adopt right away. Everyone came up with the idea of trying to become foster parents first. Everyone told them how difficult it would be, how much they could get hurt, the risks they were taking. There seemed to be no end to the stories of disappointment, frustration, theft, even violence, disappointment when children to whom the adoptive parents had become attached were taken away. However, they felt called to do it. Their first adopted child was the 5-month-old son of a dependent mother. 40 years ago, Ethan would have been called the crack baby, a term that was soon debunked by more robust and comprehensive research. This doesn't mean Ethan was an easy child. Neither of them slept well for the first 2 weeks. Connie took maternity leave from the accounting firm where she had worked as an accountant for the past 8 years to focus fully on caring for the baby they welcomed into their lives. Ethan's world had been unpleasant and loveless his entire short life, but Connie's relentless attention and love finally broke through. After 4 months of loving care, he began to sleep through the night. Hours of crying during the day were replaced by children's games and peaceful daytime dreams. His face, previously distorted by pain and anger, was now most often adorned with a smile. Social services, of course, monitored Ethan's development. One day, the social worker marveled at how much he had changed, then spent several hours asking detailed questions about how they cared for Ethan and what their typical days and nights were like. After the interview, Connie and Paul feared that the boy they loved so much would soon be taken away. A few days later, a social worker called to say that Ethan's mother had been found dead of an overdose. Nobody had any idea who the father was. Now they were sure that they would soon lose their baby. After Sunday's Mass, they expressed their grief to Father Mike's successor, Father Alberto Banuelos. He didn't react the way they expected. Instead of simply offering condolences or offering to pray with them, he offered a solution. "Why don't you adopt him? You gave this little boy happiness with love. I can't think of better parents for him. I'd be happy to say that to anyone, in writing, if it would help." Since they chose foster parenting over adoption, they hadn't even thought about adopting Ethan, but thanks to Connie's growing bond as a mother and Paul's love for her and Ethan, the idea of adopting Ethan didn't scare them. The very next Monday morning, they made an appointment with a social worker to discuss Ethan's case. The social worker was stunned by their offer to adopt. She had seen similar situations in the past that ended badly for everyone involved and didn't think it was a wise decision. She expressed her concerns, ending with what she believed was the clinching argument. And, of course, payments from the state will stop. At first, they couldn't believe that this woman thought they were being materialistic by taking care of Ethan just for the benefit. From the very first month, they deposited checks into a savings account just for Ethan, vaguely thinking of it as a college fund. Their distrust soon grew into outrage. The social worker watched the play of emotions on their faces and wondered if she had made a mistake. Well, I mean, you know, the extra expense of having a child, especially one with behavioral issues. "Shut up!" Connie's voice was dangerously calm. Paul was amazed. He had never heard her talk like that to anyone. She continued to speak in a low, monotone voice. "You have no idea what Ethan means to us. I could try to explain it to you, but I shouldn't. Besides, I'm not sure you'll understand. Your job is to do what's best for this baby, and we're the best there is for Ethan. I know it. Paul knows it. Our pastor knows it. You should know it. Hell, I think Ethan knows it, and he's not even a year old." She took a deep breath and continued, not allowing the woman to answer. "So let's try again. Paul and I love Ethan as if he were our own son. We love him so much that we want him to be our own son. We want to adopt him. Could you please fulfill your work and tell us how to proceed?" Recommendations came from Alberto's father, their pediatrician, even from Sheriff Sam Good and his wife. All paperwork and legal procedures were completed in less time than usual. And just like that, Ethan became Ethan Hansen, and happiness reigned in the Hansen household. Although they were happy that Ethan was their son, they were still upset with the caseworker for underestimating them so much. They wrote a letter to social services explaining why they no longer wanted to be foster parents. The faceless bureaucrats who ran social services responded in their usual enlightened manner. Unable to fire the caseworker because of her union contract, they reassigned her to a remote office, where she spent her days writing detailed monthly reports that no one ever read. They didn't try to convince Connie and Paul to resume foster care. Everything changed with a phone call a week after Ethan's 3rd birthday. Mrs. Hansen, this is Roger Miller, the new regional manager of social services. Firstly, please accept my apologies for treating you insensitively. This certainly does not reflect how grateful we are for the selfless dedication of each of our volunteer foster parents. Thank you, Mr. Miller. We were glad to help. And Ethan is a greater reward than we ever imagined. We are very glad that your experience turned out to be so good, and we only wish that all our affairs end just as well. He waited for her to answer without explaining the reason for his call. I've played this game before. She drew on her experience negotiating tax audits with the IRS. Let silence motivate him to get to the point. It worked. You're probably wondering why I'm calling. Connie still didn't answer. No fucking way, Sherlock. He paused again, but not for long. Can you and Mr. Hansen come to our office sometime this week? There is a question that myself and some of the staff would like to discuss with you. This is really not something we want to discuss over the phone. I'm not sure. I'll have to talk to my husband first. I'm sure you understand that our last experience with your office was not the most pleasant. I completely understand. Please call me and let me know your decision. She was as curious as Paul about what they wanted to talk about, so she called back. 2 days later, they went to the social service building. The administrator almost immediately led them into a small conference room. Miller, another man, and a woman stood up. Miller welcomed them and introduced the others. Sharon Fleming, psychiatrist, and Glenn Williams, training manager. Everyone shook hands and sat down. Miller picked up on Connie's expertise in negotiations during their phone call and got straight to the point. We have a child who desperately needs the wonderful talents you have shown with Ethan. After 3 unsuccessful placements with her, we are running out of options. Connie couldn't help herself. What? Did you send your child to 3 different families? No. Rose is not a child. She is 7 years old, almost 8. She was sexually abused by several of her mother's boyfriends for over 3 years. He turned to Sharon, asking her to describe the situation. None of the other families were able to cope with Rose, although we did our best to explain what they could expect. The longest stay was 4 months. The constant changes have sharpened Rose's defense mechanisms. She gets upset with most physical contact, especially from men. She eats reluctantly, but sparingly, and almost never speaks. She exhibits many autistic behaviors, but most likely suffers from a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Several therapists, including myself, have tried to help her, but she is not cooperating. Sharon opened her laptop in front of her. We shot some videos of her interacting with 2 foster families during placements, her reactions to therapy sessions, and just sitting alone. With your permission, I would like to bring us all coffee, tea, or soft drinks, and then watch about 20 minutes of the edited video. Connie and Paul looked at each other and nodded. Paul answered for them. Of course that would be good. Glenn asked what they wanted, and then soon returned with a tray of drinks and baked goods. Sharon played a video that appeared on a large screen at the end of the room. It was alarming, to say the least. There was no violence, no screaming or crying, just scene after scene of a solemn little girl seemingly unaware of people talking to her, offering her gifts, or placing food in front of her. She flinched whenever the woman touched her, although she eventually allowed some contact, but curled into the fetal position whenever the man even came close to her. Apart from the occasional sound of adult voices, it might as well have been a silent film. Paul spoke first. "What makes you think we could achieve anything if everyone else, even the professionals, failed? We have no training. We are not miracle workers." Glenn joined the conversation. "Your experience with Ethan became the core of one of our core training modules. Your identities, including identity Aita, of course, are not revealed, but the transition from an almost constantly anxious and unhappy child to an outwardly normal boy is clearly illustrated. The training exercises include examples of how both of you, especially Connie, use calming words, loving care, and patience to restore his happiness, especially patience. That must have been the hardest." "No, it's not was hard." Connie was adamant. "Love is patient. Love is kind. We really had no alternative. Ethan had hurt, so we did everything we could to help. We waited, then did it again, and just kept going until it got better. I'm not saying it was easy. It's just, it was the right thing to do because we love him." Their hearts went out to the solemn little girl they saw in the video. When they said they were willing to accept responsibility, Sharon said that Rose would need extensive therapy in addition to their love and care, but assured them that the government would pay all expenses. She started to add, "besides," but Roger quickly interrupted her to avoid repeating the previous experience. Sharon took them to Rose's nursery, which was filled with bright colors, children's furniture, and lots of toys and games. A nature show was playing quietly on the TV in the corner, but Rose sat in a chair facing the wall, on which only hung a poster of a circus clown. She did not acknowledge their presence. Sharon spoke to her tenderly. "Hello, Rose. You look good. These people would like to meet you." Rose didn't answer. Sharon asked Connie to meet with Rose. "This is Mrs. Hansen. She is the mother of a little boy named Ethan." She motioned for Paul to do the same. "And this is Mr. Hansen, Mrs. Hansen's husband. They both love their son very much." Again, no reaction from Rose. Despite all the discouraging signs, Connie and Paul felt called again and agreed to take Rose. It took a couple of days to prepare, including several sessions with Sharon to prepare for the next change and to prepare for the ongoing therapy sessions. When they came to pick Rose up 2 days later, Sharon led her out to their car carrying her suitcase. Rose had a small backpack and was carrying a doll. Once she was buckled into her child's car seat, Connie turned around to talk to Rose. "We're so glad you're coming to our house for a while, Rose. You'll have your own room and books to read and a TV, even a computer if you want to use it." The answer was silence. Connie and Paul were ready to give everything to break it and hear Rose's voice. They felt lost in a foreign country and did not know the language. Rose stayed in her room except to go to the bathroom. She never spoke, never smiled, never indicated that she was aware of their presence. At Sharon's recommendation, for the first 2 weeks, Connie brought Rose's food to her room and then left so Rose could decide what to eat or not eat without feeling pressured. The first week she ate bits of food, but always drank milk and sometimes had dessert if it was sliced apples or bananas. She was getting enough nutrition that Connie and Paul wouldn't worry too much. Dressing, undressing, bathing, and bedtime were even more challenging. The first night following Sharon's advice, Connie showed Rose where her clothes were, where the bathroom was, how the bath worked, her towels, toothbrush, and toothpaste. They returned to Rose's room, where Connie laid out a pair of pajamas, then said goodnight, walked out, and closed the door. Connie checked 3 times to see if Rose was okay, but no matter how quietly she opened the door, the light from the hallway reflected off her wide eyes, and Connie quietly closed the door. In the morning, Connie found the bed made, pajamas and the clothes Rose had been wearing neatly folded by the pillow. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings, Connie took Rose to the social services building for therapy sessions. After each session, Sharon gave Rose a juice box and took her to the playroom, where Rose sat facing a wall with a clown poster. Connie and Sharon then shared a cup of coffee and discussed how things were going. Connie wasn't fooling herself. She knew that coffee meetings with Sharon were almost therapy sessions, but that didn't bother her. In fact, she welcomed them. Rose's continued silence was unsettling. and Connie was beginning to doubt whether they would ever be able to help Rose. By the end of the second week, Rose was eating almost everything. On Friday, she brought the dinner tray back to the kitchen and returned to her room without saying a word. Connie cried with joy. Paul hugged her, stroked her hair, then whispered, "Maybe love really does conquer all." Over the next few weeks, Rose continued to bring her trays, soon from all 3 meals, into the kitchen. Up until this point, Connie had stuck to their evening routine. Encouraged by what she thought was a breakthrough with the trays, one evening Connie waited for Rose to turn off the lights in her room, then opened the door. Rose was getting into bed and looked surprised when Connie entered. "I was wondering if you'd like me to read you a bedtime story." Rose hesitated, then nodded and crawled under the covers. Connie brought some books. Rose pointed to one, then Connie put the rest down and read until Rose closed her eyes a few minutes later. She covered Rose, kissed her tenderly on the forehead, went into the kitchen, and cried with happiness. As they prepared for bed, Paul took Connie's hands. "Maybe it's time to invite Rose to eat with us, maybe tomorrow night for dinner." They made love that night, and then they both got the best sleep they'd had in a long time. The next day, when Paul returned from work, Connie came into Rose's room and asked if she wanted to eat dinner with them. Rose looked scared and slowly shook her head. Slowly at first, then faster and faster. Finally, she walked around the bed, sat on the edge, and stared at the empty wall. Connie was devastated. It took Paul almost an hour to calm her down. "Why did you make me invite her to eat with us? It ruined everything. We were in a hurry, just like Sharon warned." "Oh God, Paul, what have we done? We'll never be able to help her. We'll be Rose's 4th failure." After bitter tears, she hugged Paul. "I'm sorry I said that, Paul. You didn't force me. It's not your fault. Neither of us know what to do." The tears continued, albeit less destructively, but no matter how comforting Paul spoke, she began to cry in her sleep. The help they needed came from a source they should have expected, but did not. Ethan had been curious about Rose from the moment she first appeared, but when she did not respond to his conversations and recoiled from his touch, he began to avoid her. The next morning, he heard Connie crying again and listened as she repeated her fears to Paul at breakfast. She was so upset during the day that she didn't notice that Ethan wasn't bothering her, but occasionally came into the kitchen for a cookie or a glass of juice. Connie's despondency subsided a little when Rose carried her tray into the kitchen and returned to her room. Paul put Ethan to bed, but Connie didn't try to read Rose or get her to sleep. They sat in the living room with cups of tea and began to read. He in his rocking chair, she on the sofa. She didn't really read, just stared at her book, trying not to think about her failure with Rose. Within minutes, her world lit up. Carrying one of his books, Ethan led Rose by the hand into the living room, both in their pajamas. He climbed onto the sofa, then asked her to sit next to him. "I asked Rose to read me my favorite book. She agreed because she loved me, and I told her I loved her too." Both adults held their breath as he pressed himself against her to see the pictures better, but Rose looked at him and smiled. Her parents, suddenly they dared to feel like parents, were trying not to scream or cry when she started reading Goodnight Moon, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. She had difficulty with some words, but Ethan helped. He had heard his favorite book at least 100 times and almost memorized it. When she finished, Ethan's eyes were closed and he was leaning on her. She looked straight at Connie. "I think he fell asleep." These were the first words Connie and Paul heard from her. She closed the book, didn't flinch when Connie picked up Ethan, and followed silently as Connie carried Ethan to their rooms. Rose, of course, did not turn into an ordinary little girl. Over the next year and a half, it was usually 1 step forward and 1 step back, but sometimes it was 2 steps forward before 1 step back. Sharon continued her therapy sessions, but began to encourage Connie during their therapy sessions, which both pretended to be just conversations. Much of the progress was thanks to Ethan. Rose had long conversations with him, but still, only said a few random words to the adults. 2 or 3 times a week, Ethan and Rose would join Connie and Paul in the living room. Rose would read him a book. Then Connie would put them to bed. One evening, after several months of such meetings, the two children entered the living room as usual, but Ethan handed the book to Paul. "Rose wants you to read to her." He could have said, "Rose went to Harvard." He returned and sat down next to Rose. Paul was reading a book, trying to act as if it were normal. Connie, still stunned by this development, put them to bed as usual. She and Paul then drank a glass of wine and spent the next hour trying to understand what had just happened and thinking about how to proceed. Ethan told them much later that it was his idea. He had to ask Rose 4 times before she agreed to let Paul read to her. She agreed when Ethan told her that Paul was sad because he was the only one who didn't read to her. Sharon was shocked when Connie told her what happened. She questioned Connie for almost an hour and took a lot of notes. The following week, she told Connie that, with their permission, she wanted to write an article about the remarkable therapeutic effects of Ethan's interventions. As with the curriculum, none of the main characters will be identified. Connie and Paul insisted that neither Ethan nor Rose be interviewed. Sharon agreed and said she was going to wait a little while to see how things developed before submitting the article. Yes, they can read it before sending it. They can suggest changes, but Sharon is not obligated to accept them. After lengthy discussion, Connie and Paul agreed on the condition that they could revoke permission at any time before dispatch. Over time, Ethan became their unofficial representative to Rose, especially to Paul. Gradually, she began to feel more comfortable around him thanks to Ethan's tireless stories about how kind and smart Paul was. His efforts culminated on an evening a year and a half after Rose joined the Hansen family. Ethan and Rose walked into the living room, Rose carrying one of her books. As usual, Ethan climbed onto the couch and Rose walked over to Paul in his rocking chair. "Could you read it to me, Paul?" When he agreed, she handed him the book, but instead of returning to sit next to Ethan, she climbed onto his lap. "This is fine?" Paul fought hard not to hug her and was able to say, "Of course," without shaking in his voice. Connie covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears. Ethan smiled. Paul began to read. When he finished and closed the book, Rose hugged him, said thank you, and kissed him on the cheek. He looked to Connie for clues, but she shrugged and whispered, "I don't know." Paul finally extended his arms towards Rose without touching her. She smiled and hugged him as tightly as she could. Paul hugged her back, very carefully. "I love you, Rose." Despite his best efforts, his voice wavered. "I love you too, Paul, and I love Ethan, and I love Connie. Thank you." Connie, Paul, and Rose shed tears of joy. Ethan smiled. Sharon began to wrap up her therapy sessions. She decided not to submit the article to the magazine because she did not want to risk violating the Hansen family's privacy. On the 2nd anniversary of Rose's arrival at Connie's house, they adopted Rose and the Hansen family was complete. On Christmas Eve 20 years later, Paul and Connie sat on the sofa in front of the fireplace with mugs of hot chocolate. The midnight mass was again very crowded. Father Mike was right. Changing the start time to 7:30 p.m. was a wise decision. It's good that he lived to see the results. Connie never returned to work. Ethan earned an associate's degree in automotive engineering from a local college and landed a good job at a local GMC dealership. Rose completed a nursing program at the same college, then won a scholarship to pursue a bachelor's degree in nursing at a nearby state college. She was working as a nurse in the emergency room at the same hospital where Paul and Connie were fixed up, and there were rumors that she might soon be promoted to head nurse. They both expected a wonderful Christmas. The children and grandchildren will come for Christmas lunch in the afternoon. Cakes are baked, gifts from Santa for the grandkids are wrapped and tucked away. No assembly required, thank goodness. Connie set down her mug and lifted Paul's left arm to get cozy. She saw him wince. "Is your shoulder bothering you today?" "A little. Nothing hot chocolate and a little love won't cure it." Connie tried to snuggle closer, then sighed. "Sometimes I see God's grace when I look at Ethan and Rose." "Me too. Who would have thought that this terrible Christmas Eve would bring us such blessings?" They finished their hot chocolate, turned off the Christmas lights, and went upstairs to give each other an early Christmas present. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.